By 1930, Hollywood had already spent nearly a decade attempting to manage public criticism through self-regulation. During the 1920s, the American film industry had grown into one of the most influential entertainment industries in the world. Movie theaters were opening across the country, and millions of people attended screenings each week. Films were no longer a novelty. They had become a central part of American popular culture. But this popularity came with scrutiny. Religious organizations, social reform groups, and local governments increasingly argued that movies had a powerful influence on public behavior, particularly on young audiences. Unlike theater or literature, films were inexpensive, accessible, and widely consumed by working-class audiences and children. To critics, this made movies uniquely dangerous. By the late 1920s, the industry faced a serious risk. If Hollywood did not regulate itself, the federal government might step in and impose nationwide censorship. In response, the industry formalized what became known as the Production Code, a document intended to standardize content and reassure the public that motion pictures would uphold moral standards. This episode examines how the code was written, what it required, how it was enforced, and why it ultimately became one of the most powerful censorship systems in American media history. In 1922, the film industry created a new trade organization known as the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, often abbreviated as the MPPDA. The organization was designed to represent the interests of the major Hollywood studios and to coordinate industry policies. To lead it, the studios selected Will H. Hayes. Hayes had previously served as U.S. Postmaster General under President Warren G. Harding, and he had also chaired the Republican National Committee. Importantly, Hayes had no background in filmmaking. Instead, he was chosen because of his political connections and reputation for integrity. Hollywood executives believed that placing a respected public official in charge would help improve the industry's image and reassure critics that studios were committed to responsible behavior. Hayes quickly became the public face of Hollywood's effort to reform itself. He promoted the idea that the film industry could regulate its own content without government interference. If the industry demonstrated responsibility, Hayes argued, outside censorship would be unnecessary. Throughout the 1920s, the MPPDA issued advisory guidelines and encouraged studios to avoid controversial topics. However, these early efforts were inconsistent. Studios often prioritized box office success over moral guidelines, and films sometimes included provocative themes such as sexual relationships outside marriage, organized crime, and corrupt authority figures. By the end of the decade, it was clear that informal guidelines were not enough. A more comprehensive system was needed. Even before the full production code was formally adopted, Hollywood had already experimented with earlier attempts at content regulation. In 1927, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America circulated a document known as the Don'ts and Be Carefuls. This list was one of the first organized attempts by the film industry to establish guidelines about potentially controversial content. The document divided sensitive topics into two categories. The first category, known as the Don'ts, included subjects that were considered completely unacceptable for motion pictures. These included explicit nudity, illegal drug use, sexual perversion, a vague term that guidelines used to include homosexuality, and profanity involving religious figures. The second category was labeled as the Be Carefuls. These topics were not entirely forbidden, but filmmakers were advised to treat them with caution and restraint. Examples included seduction, childbirth, interracial relationships, and detailed methods of committing crimes. The purpose of this list was to help studios avoid provoking public outrage or attracting the attention of censorship boards. However, the guidelines were not strictly enforced during the late 1920s and early 1930s. As a result, many filmmakers continued to experiment with controversial themes. Several films from this period openly pushed the boundaries of what audiences were expected to see on screen. For example, Babyface starred Barbara Stanwyck as Lily Powers, a woman who strategically uses sexual relationships with powerful men to climb the corporate ladder. The film portrays her ambition and manipulation with a level of frankness that would later become difficult under strict code enforcement. Another well-known example is Scarface, directed by Howard Hawks. The film followed the violent rise of gangster Tony Camonte, whose ambition and brutality mirror the real-world growth of organized crime during the Prohibition era. Critics argued that the film glamorized criminal lifestyles, particularly because the protagonist appears charismatic and successful for much of the story. Films like these illustrate the creative freedom that existed during the early 1930s. Historians later began referring to this brief period as pre-code Hollywood, a time when filmmakers explored themes that would soon be heavily restricted. In 1930, the MPPDA adopted a formal document known as the Motion Picture Production Code. The code was written primarily by two figures outside the film industry. The first was Martin Quigley, a Catholic publisher who edited a trade journal called Motion Picture Herald. The second was Daniel A. Lord, a Jesuit priest and educator. Together, Quigley and Lord believed that movies had enormous influence over public morality. Their goal was not simply to censor films, but to guide the industry toward what they believed was morally responsible storytelling. The document they produced reflected this philosophy. Rather than beginning with rules, the code opened with a lengthy preamble explaining why movies carried social responsibility. The preamble argued that motion pictures were uniquely powerful because they combined visual storytelling with mass distribution. A single film could reach millions of viewers. Because of this influence, the code stated that filmmakers had a responsibility to avoid promoting immoral behavior. The code insisted that audiences should never sympathize with crime, wrongdoing, or evil. Even when controversial topics appeared in film, they had to be presented in a way that reinforced moral lessons. However, in its early years, the code lacked strong enforcement mechanisms. Studios could technically ignore it, and many did. At the heart of the production code was a very specific philosophy about the power of media. The code treated movies not simply as entertainment, but as a form of moral instruction. In the early 20th century, many social reformers believed that mass media had the ability to shape public behavior. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and popular literature were already widely consumed, but motion pictures were considered uniquely influential. Unlike print media, films presented vivid visual narratives that audiences could watch unfold in real time. Viewers could see characters behave, speak, and interact in ways that felt immediate and emotionally persuasive. Because of this immersive quality, critics of the film industry argued that movies could influence audiences, especially young people, more directly than other forms of media. If films presented immoral behavior in a glamorous or sympathetic way, reformers feared that viewers might imitate what they saw on screen. The production code therefore insisted that films present what it called correct standards of life. This idea reflected a broader cultural belief that popular entertainment should reinforce social stability. Films were expected to support dominant norms about family structure, respect for authority, religious values, and the rule of law. Crime could appear in films, but criminals could not be admired or portrayed as role models. Adultery could be referenced, but it could not be presented as attractive, romantic, or rewarding. Authority figures, including police officers, judges, government officials, and clergy, had to be treated with respect. Portrayals that suggested corruption or incompetence among these institutions were strongly discouraged. These expectations influenced not only what stories could be told, but also how those stories had to unfold. Filmmakers often had to carefully structure their narrative so that wrongdoing was clearly condemned and moral order was restored by the conclusion of the film. For example, a character might commit crimes during the story, but the film would ultimately require that that character be punished, arrested, or morally redeemed before the ending. This narrative pattern ensured that audiences left the theater with the impression that justice had prevailed. In this way, the production code functioned less like a simple censorship rulebook and more like a framework for storytelling. It shaped character arcs, plot structures, and even the emotional tone of Hollywood films for decades. The production code summarized its philosophy through three general principles that guided all film production. First, no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Second, correct standards of life shall be presented. Third, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. These three statements formed the ideological foundation of the entire code. Although they were relatively brief, they carried broad implications for how stories could be written and filmed. The first principle reflected the belief that audiences might imitate behavior they saw on screen. If immoral actions appeared glamorous or consequence-free, critics worried that films could normalize those behaviors. The second principle reinforced the expectation that films should promote socially accepted values. Characters were expected to behave in ways that aligned with dominant cultural ideals about marriage, family life, gender roles, and religion. The third principle addressed respect for authority and social order. Films were discouraged from portraying criminals as heroes or from presenting institutions such as the legal system as ineffective or corrupt. In order to translate these broad principles into practical guidelines, the code included a detailed list of specific restrictions. For example, explicit sexual content was prohibited, and scenes involving romantic intimacy had to be limited in both duration and intensity. Passionate kissing, for instance, was sometimes shortened or edited to avoid appearing too suggestive. Interracial romantic relationships, referred to in the code using the term miscegenation, were banned entirely. Profanity involving religious terms such as God, Jesus, or hell was restricted, especially when used in a casual or disrespectful context. Graphic violence was discouraged, and filmmakers were warned against showing detailed methods of committing crimes that audiences might potentially imitate. While these rules might seem straightforward, their interpretation often required extensive negotiation between filmmakers and code officials. Directors, writers, and producers frequently searched for creative ways to suggest ideas indirectly while still technically complying with the regulations. As a result, many films from the Code era relied heavily on implication, symbolism, and carefully crafted dialogue to convey themes that could not be stated openly. Pressure on Hollywood intensified dramatically in the early 1930s. In 1933, the Catholic Church helped organize a nationwide movement known as the National Legion of Decency. The Legion was created to mobilize Catholic audiences against films that church leaders believed were immoral. Millions of Catholics were encouraged to sign a pledge promising to avoid movies considered morally offensive. The pledge read in part, "I promise to remain away from all motion pictures except those which do not offend decency and Christian morality." The Legion reviewed films and published ratings in Catholic newspapers. Movies could be labeled morally unobjectionable, morally objectionable, and condemned. A film labeled condemned could face widespread boycotts from Catholic audiences. Because Catholics represented a large portion of moviegoers in many American cities, these boycotts had real financial consequences. Hollywood executives quickly realized that organized moral protests could affect box office revenue. The Legion's influence marked a turning point. It demonstrated that moral pressure groups could directly shape the film industry's economic success. By 1934, pressure from religious organizations, civic reform groups, and censorship advocates had intensified significantly. Among the most influential critics was the Catholic Church, which helped organize the Legion of Decency, a nationwide movement encouraging Catholics to boycott films considered morally objectionable. Because millions of Americans identified as Catholic, this campaign represented a serious economic threat to the film industry. Facing the possibility of widespread boycotts and increase in political pressure, Hollywood studios concluded that stronger enforcement of their existing rules was necessary. In response, the MPPDA created a new regulatory office called the Production Code Administration, commonly known as the PCA. The PCA was responsible for ensuring that every film released by major Hollywood studios complied with the production code. Under this system, filmmakers were required to submit their scripts for review before production began. PCA officials would read the scripts carefully and suggest changes if any scenes appeared to violate the code. Once filming was complete, the finished movie had to be screened again for approval. Only after passing this review could a film receive an official certificate allowing it to be distributed to theaters. This process transformed the code from a set of recommendations into a formal enforcement system. Studios could no longer ignore the guidelines or interpret them loosely. Instead, compliance became an essential part of the filmmaking process from the earliest stages of script development through final editing. The Production Code Administration was headed by Joseph Breen, who quickly became one of the most powerful and controversial figures in Hollywood. Breen was a journalist and devout Catholic with strong beliefs about the moral responsibilities of the film industry. Under his leadership, the PCA adopted a strict and systematic approach to enforcing the code. Breen personally reviewed thousands of scripts and maintained extensive correspondence with studio executives, producers, and screenwriters. When a script included material that violated the code, Breen's office would send detailed memos explaining what needed to be changed. These notes often addressed very specific details, including dialogue, costume choices, camera angles, and character motivations. Thousands of these internal memos still survive today, providing historians with a detailed record of the negotiations that took place behind the scenes. In some cases, filmmakers were required to rewrite entire scenes or restructure their stories in order to satisfy code requirements. Under Breen's leadership, enforcement became highly systematic. Crime films were required to ensure that criminals were ultimately punished by the legal system. Adulterous relationships could not be portrayed as glamorous or fulfilling. References to homosexuality, then categorized under the code's term sexual perversion, were limited entirely from mainstream Hollywood films. Because approval was required before release, filmmakers often revised their scripts multiple times during production. This process sometimes created tension between creative artists and code officials, but it also encouraged filmmakers to develop subtle storytelling techniques that implied controversial ideas without stating them directly. Beginning in 1934, the Production Code Administration required every film released by major Hollywood studios to display an official approval seal. This seal usually appeared during the opening credits and served as a visual certification that the film had passed code review. To audiences, the seal functioned as a sign that the movie met the industry's moral standards. For theater owners and distributors, however, it carried even greater practical importance. Major theater chains, many of which were owned or affiliated with the Hollywood studios themselves, generally refused to screen films that lacked PCA certification. Without the seal, a film could struggle to secure distribution in major urban markets. This policy effectively gave the PCA tremendous influence over the entire film industry. Even independent producers who were not directly part of the studio system often felt compelled to seek approval because theaters would hesitate to show uncertified films. The seal therefore served two functions simultaneously. It acted as a moral endorsement, signaling that a film complied with acceptable standards of decency. At the same time, it operated as an economic gatekeeping mechanism that controlled which films could reach national audiences. Studios that attempted to bypass the production code faced significant consequences. The MPPDA could impose financial penalties on companies that released films without PCA approval. These fines could reach substantial amounts, making non-compliance an expensive risk. More importantly, films without the approval seal could be denied access to major distribution networks. During the 1930s, the Hollywood film industry operated under a system known as vertical integration. Major studios not only produced films, but also controlled the companies responsible for distributing those films, and in many cases, owned the theaters in which they were shown. This structure meant that a small number of studios controlled nearly every stage of the filmmaking business. If a movie failed to receive PCA approval, it could be excluded from this entire network. Without access to major theaters, the film would have little chance of reaching a large audience or earning significant revenue. As a result, studios almost always complied with the code's requirements rather than risking financial losses. Technically, the production code system was voluntary. The government did not legally require filmmakers to follow it. In practice, however, the economic realities of the studio system made compliance nearly unavoidable. By the mid-1930s, the production code had transformed from a loosely defined set of moral guidelines into one of the most powerful systems of media regulation in American history. What began as an attempt to protect Hollywood's public image became a deeply institutionalized process that shaped nearly every aspect of filmmaking. Through the leadership of Will H. Hayes, the influence of outside reformers like Martin Quigley and Daniel A. Lord, the pressure of the Legion of Decency, and the strict enforcement of the Production Code Administration under Joseph Breen, the film industry created a system that controlled not just what audiences saw, but how stories could be told. The code did more than censor individual scenes. It reshaped narrative structure, character development, and the moral framework of Hollywood cinema. Filmmakers were required to construct stories where justice prevailed, authority was respected, and social norms were reinforced. Every script, every line of dialogue, and even every camera angle had to pass through a system designed to ensure that films upheld what the industry defined as correct standards of life. And yet, within these constraints, filmmakers did not simply stop being creative. They adapted. Writers, directors, and actors began to develop new ways of communicating meaning through implication, symbolism, visual suggestion, and subtext. What could not be shown directly was often hinted at indirectly, giving rise to a more subtle and coded form of storytelling that would come to define the classic Hollywood style. But this raises an important question. What exactly wasn't allowed on screen? What kind of stories were silenced, altered, or hidden beneath layers of implication? And how did filmmakers find ways to work around these restrictions? In Episode 3, we'll explore the boundaries of the production code in detail.